Hey, it's April 14th, 2022, and I wanted to post at least one video on Easter and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. I wanted to start in Luke 22 just briefly with a mildly humorous event, in my opinion, and then move to the actual crucifixion of Christ, which is recorded in Luke 23. So first of all, just to introduce the situation when Jesus was arrested in the garden. Jesus had told his disciples that initially he sent them out without cloaks or food or things like that. And then he later said, you better bring an extra cloak and extra sandals and a sword. Peter responded and said, "Here are 2 swords," and Jesus says, "That's enough." It turns out that Peter made sure he had one of the swords, but the indicators are that he wasn't that great a swordsman. When Jesus was arrested in the garden by a group of soldiers led by Judas Iscariot, Peter decided that shouldn't happen. And so it records at the end of Luke 22 there in verse 47 and following that Peter took the sword and hacked off the ear of one Malchus, who was a servant of the high priest. Now, it seems very logical that Peter was aiming to, hit him squarely in the middle of the head. He just missed by about 6 inches and took his ear off. And Jesus responded and said, "No more of this." In other words, he didn't want the disciples to protect him. The swords were for them to protect them. And it says, and he reached out and touched the servant, and the ear was restored. So 2 things are possible. One, that Jesus somehow magically moved the ear that was hacked off from the ground and put it back on the man. Or the other, which I particularly like, is that perhaps Jesus just created a man with 3 ears. He would have 2 ears on his head, and then 1 ear was laying somewhere on the ground, kind of trashed. But anyway, just an interesting note concerning Peter's swordsmanship or lack of it. Now, Jesus goes through these official but illegal trials and is finally deemed innocent, and Pilate sentences to die by execution on a cross. Kind of strange to declare a person innocent. Pilate said, "I find no fault in him," and yet then to sentence him to death on a cross. Well, while Jesus was on the cross, 3 interesting things happened. Well, there's a lot of interesting things that happen, but the first thing that I see here in Luke 23 is the reality that Jesus forgives those who had nailed him to that cross. But then it immediately moves to the scribes and Pharisees in chapter 23, and let me read just a little bit of it. It says that verse 35, they said, "He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one." So they mock him and they say, let him save himself. Now the implication was clear that Jesus had saved others in terms of physically healed them. And more importantly, which I'm sure a lot of people weren't aware of, he was going to save all those who would put their faith in him based on their sins being forgiven because of his paying the penalty for their sins on the cross. So the first thing that happens is the leaders of Israel, the people standing around, they say, "Save yourself." It's kind of ironic that decades ago a movie came out called The Last Temptation of Christ. The title was a lie because the movie claimed that the last temptation of Christ was being tempted by Mary Magdalene. That's obviously absurd and a very secular and distorted view. Rather, there's no question in my mind that the last temptation of Christ occurred on the cross when this first group of people said, save yourself. But then the soldiers also chime in, if you will, and they say, let him save himself. And finally, one of the thieves hanging on a cross near him said, let him save himself. So it seems very solid, in my opinion, to believe that the last temptation of Christ was for him to save himself, which, based on his power as a Son of God, he could have saved himself. But the narrative in Luke continues in chapter 23. And what happens is we'll see each of these three groups that mocked him, members of those groups turned their view around. First, the leaders and the people. One of the leaders was Nicodemus. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, those 70 Jewish men that led the spiritual lives of the people of Israel. And Nicodemus, as well as Joseph of Arimathea, buried Jesus, arranged to pick up his body. And so clearly they had no part in saying he should save himself. Rather, they recognized, at least would ultimately, that he could save them. Then it turns out that also, whereas the soldiers sneered at Jesus and said, save yourself, the leader of the soldiers, a centurion, a man generally in charge of 100, that's what centurion means, but typically it was either more or less as the various members of the centurion's soldiers either died or other members were added. But basically a centurion was over approximately 100 soldiers. Well, the centurion says, truly, this was the Son of God. So in contrast to the other soldiers who crucified Jesus, although he was a part of that, he was convinced that Jesus was the Son of God. Many could argue that he recognized his need and was saved by the Lord Jesus Christ. Finally, one of the men on the cross said, let him save himself. And ultimately, the other one changed his mind and said, why are you mocking him? We're in the same condition. We deserve it. He didn't. And that thief on the cross said to Jesus, let me enter into paradise sometime. And Jesus responded and said, this day you will be with me in paradise. So Luke crafts this in a very interesting way, that he has the leaders, the people of Israel, the soldiers, and then the thieves on the cross all tempting him, saying, save yourself. And yet members of each of those three groups turn to Jesus, recognize his deity. And so it's kind of a picture, if you will, of the reality that even if we at some point may have mocked the Lord Jesus Christ, it is possible, it's appropriate, for us to turn and recognize that Jesus is the Son of God and he offers salvation to the world. Many blessings to you all.